Hello and welcome to another GiantSlayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today I'll be counting down the top 5 compositions from all of Set 6. That's right, all of it. This means we'll be taking compositions from both Gizmos and Gadgets as well as Neon Knights. The criteria here is mostly any composition that defined either set or compositions that did well in both. Keep in mind this spans quite a long period of time, and the most egregious of boards will stick out in our minds. Warwick Reroll, for example, terrorized the mid-set, but in the grand scheme of the whole set, it was only a small blip. A terrible, memorable, and frightening blip, but a blip nonetheless. Consistency is the key, as is always the case for our top 5s. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started with the composition coming in at number 5, Sivir. If you don't think Sivir would find her way onto the list, then you must not have been paying attention to the entirety of the mid-set. No other composition comes close to the impact Sivir had on the meta, as boards utilizing Sivir carry had managed to stay relevant the whole time. Whether that's Hextech, Striker, a mix of the two, or even things like Socialite, Sivir as one of the main carries has remained near the top of the meta consistently. Of course, the composition itself has changed over time, as the only core part of it is using Sivir as either the main damage dealer or in conjunction with another champion. Aurelia is the most common secondary carry with Sivir, usually on a Striker board. The reason we're not calling it just Strikers is consistency. Striker has historically done well in the mid-set, but Hextech has had plenty of time in the sun as well, and both variations include Sivir, thus why we're just calling it a blanket composition of Sivir. The defining characteristic why this composition done so well throughout the mid-set is because it provides consistent and safe damage. The Striker trait helps by boosting the overall damage of its units, while Hextech adds survivability and bonus magic damage. Point is, both variations are there to help Sivir dish out the damage. Aurelia also swoops in to clean up with resets, while Lucian and Alistar are key for the Hextech board. At the end of the day, the main culprit for Sivir doing well is Sivir herself. She's a backline carry with an attack speed stim ability that also hits multiple units. On top of that, both of her synergies help boost her damage output in different ways, and for Hextech, it also provides extra survivability. Sivir has also been one of the best item holders for Last Whisper, which is an item that has been quite important throughout the whole set. Mix everything together, and it's clear that Sivir, Strikers, and Hextech had a major impact on the meta for Neon Knights. Up next is a composition that does span both sets, but is primarily known for its impact on Gizmos and Gadgets. We're of course talking about the number 4 composition, Challengers. We know it's been a minute since Gizmos and Gadgets was playable, but for anyone looking back on the meta for the first time in the set, one of the most memorable units should be Yone. Yone was a 4-cost Challenger Academy champion and, much like Sivir, had a hand in the meta cookie jar for basically all of the first half of the set. In fact, Yone being removed basically killed Challengers and Neon Knights. Yone isn't the only memorable Challenger from the first half, as Fiora also played a key role in that comp. Fiora was also removed, and again, this left a hole in the Challenger meta for the mid-set. But Challengers didn't completely die out, as champions like Warwick, Tryndamere, and Draven still utilized the synergy, albeit barely. Kai'Sa also brought some value to the Challenger trait across both sets, though she primarily got played with mutants. Point is that even if Challengers had a diminished presence in the mid-set meta, they were still playable and had a few times where they did well. Hence why Challenger is slightly lower on the list than Sivir. That said, the main reason we're including Challengers is because of how impactful it was on the first half of Set 6. Yone and Fiora, as mentioned, had a huge role in the meta for all of Gizmos and Gadgets, and there was definitely no shot we'd leave them out of the top 5. Once again, a large reason for this composition doing well was in particular one unit, that one being Yone. Yone, like Sivir, had 2 really good synergies that basically boosted his stats. Despite being melee, Yone also had access to the backline thanks to his ability that also provided a bit of sustain. Basically, Yone was to melee carries what Sivir was to ranged. One of the reasons Challengers didn't pick up as much traction in the mid-set as the first half is because it lacked champions that really benefited from having more Challengers on the board. Both Yone and Fiora got a lot stronger the faster they attacked, and having the attack speed meant they could either build damage-focused items or more survivability. Being melee carries, having extra survivability helped a lot and kept them alive a lot longer. Whereas champions like Draven or Tryndamere didn't necessarily need the extra attack speed. The initial boost was enough, and having the stats from other synergy was more important. On all, Yone with Fiora and Challengers will go down as a defining composition of the first half of Set 6, while Challengers in the mid-set will more than likely be the thought of Warwick and not so much the synergy itself. From here on, the rest of the top compositions are ones that had a major presence in both halves of the set. Coming in at number 3 is Arcanists. Honestly, when we look back on the whole set, Arcanist didn't immediately stand out as a memorable composition. Only when we dug through previous top 5s and looked at how the meta formed throughout the set did we take note of the comp. That's because Arcanists have always been a consistent part of the meta, but never felt overpowered. Of course, there have been some metas where they did better than other composition, but were there any major memorable moments that come to mind? Not really. That begs the question, why is Arcanist in the top 5 for the whole set? Because consistency is always what we're looking for in our top 5s, and few other compositions remained as consistent throughout all of set 6 as Arcanist. While they didn't show up in every single top 5, they had a presence in most of the patches throughout both halves of the set, whether that was Lux and Gizmos and Gadgets or Ahri and Neon Knights. Other key champions were Vex, Malzahar, and Victor. Those three had a lot of important roles throughout set 6. Vex was a frontliner, Malzahar as utility with a gateway for Synaptic Web, while Victor held down the late game. We will say that the first half of the set had a much more prominent Arcanist meta because Lux was, on average, a more reliable 4-cost AP carry than Ahri. It can also be argued that Twisted Fate was a better overall item holder than Brand, but that's splitting hairs at that point. What the point actually is that Arcanist always had a key role in the meta as consistent AP compositions. Sure, there were other options at times, but if you wanted to play a solid mid-game AP board, Arcanists were almost always the go-to option. The key was the two 4-cost carries, Lux and Ahri. While we did say Lux was overall more reliable, both of them did well at ramping up in combat to win the round and had solid secondary synergies to work with, Lux with Academy and Ahri with Syndicate. And as mentioned, the backup Arcanists were pivotal in helping the composition come together cohesively. While Arcanist may end up being forgettable for set 6, it's undeniable that they had an important role as a top meta comp. Surprisingly, the number 2 composition for all of set 6 is none other than Chemtech Bruiser. Now, we could get a bit vague on the exact definition of this composition because we could also just call it Chemtech, but in general, when Chemtech was utilized, so was Bruiser. Just saying Chemtech would feel a bit disingenuous, especially because Bruiser was a key part of the composition with both Renata and Urgot. The reason we're calling this surprising is that, like Arcanist, Chemtech Bruiser didn't really stand out as all that memorable. Oh, it's had moments like Warwick Reroll, but even then, it's more because Warwick and not because of the Chemtech Bruisers. But once again, when delving into the entirety of the set 6 meta, it's clear that more often than not, Chemtech Bruiser was a top 5 comp. This makes sense when you consider the first half of the set, as Urgot was essentially the ranged version of Yone. Urgot was used almost as often as Yone, just with Chemtech instead of Challenger. While we can't say Urgot was as strong as, say, Sivir, he did fill a much-needed role as being a 4-cost backline carry. Granted, his range was a bit shorter, so he was kind of a hybrid, but the point stands, Urgot was the ranged carry for Gizmos and Gadgets. There was also another key champion that was both Chemtech and Bruiser, Dr. Mundo. Mundo also had a third synergy mutant which tied him into several compositions throughout the first half of the set. Losing Mundo was definitely noticeable in the mid-set, though Urgot's loss wasn't as devastating since Sivir took over as the premier ranged carry. Speaking of the mid-set, the presence of Chemtech Bruiser was definitely diminished, though it was saved by Renata. Renata wasn't always part of the meta, but there were plenty of times that Renata Bruiser did well, and she played a key role in keeping AD boards in check. Honestly, it wasn't until Morellonomicon got gutted at the end of the set that Renata really fell off, as she always had some sort of presence in the meta before then. With Renata and Neon Knights and Urgot Mundo for Gizmos and Gadgets, it's clear that Chemtech Bruiser was always a staple of the meta for set 6. Again, we don't necessarily think this will end up being memorable, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it was a consistent top composition. And finally, the number 1 composition for all of set 6 is Innovator. Of the compositions on this list, Innovators at number 1 should be the least surprising. It had to be number 1 just from the sheer number of times that Innovator was the top composition in the meta across both halves of the set. Even when Innovator wasn't the strongest, it still had a presence because Innovator synergy was just too darn good for flex boards. That's the real key reason we have Innovators at number 1, flex play. No other synergy or board comes close to how effective Innovators were at promoting a flexible composition. Tons of different carries were playable with a bunch of different synergies capable of being flexed in. In Gizmos and Gadgets, we did see more full-on Innovator boards, especially since it felt easier to dominate a game with 7 Innovator Dragon. In Neon Knights, the synergies were shifted more towards flex play with multiple viable carries and synergies. You could go on and on about Innovators as a composition because there were a ton of different variations that did well in various metas. But to keep it brief, we'll end it here by saying Innovators will go down as one of the most memorable synergies and compositions for set 6, especially in regards to flex play. Alright, that wraps up our top 5 compositions for the whole of set 6. But before we go, we do have a few honorable mentions to talk about briefly. We'd be remiss to not bring up mutants when looking back at the meta for set 6. Throughout both halves of the set, mutants have had their place in the meta. Why we decided not to put them in the top 5 is mainly not being as impactful as the other comps. Mutants certainly did well a number of times. The Synaptic Web definitely got a lot of attention, but since it's a synergy that can be different every game, it's not going to be as consistently impactful as, say, Sivir or Innovators. Mutants certainly had a lot going on for them, but in the grand scheme of the meta, they just didn't quite hit the mark. Flash in the pan compositions are certainly memorable, but they often get balanced out quickly. One such composition is Warwick Reroll. Warwick had a huge impact on the game for a couple of patches, almost bringing us back to ye old Warweek. But at the end of the day, it was a short-lived composition, though certainly one people will remember. Our final honorable mention is in the same vein as Warwick, but instead highlights reroll compositions as a whole for set 6. There have been quite a few over the course of the set, such as Katarina, Shaco, Talon, Warwick, Brand, and a few others. Yordles were also, at least for a time, well known as a reroll composition. While none of these compositions stood the test of time, rerolling was relatively common throughout most of set 6. There were a few dry spells where there were no reroll boards, but most metas had at least one. Most of them were memorable without being too egregious, with the exception of Warwick and maybe Katarina at her peak. All this was a decent set for reroll boards that helped them be fun without taking too much fun away from other players. And that's all for today, folks. It's always a pleasure to look back on the entirety of a set to see where the meta changed or stayed the same. Let us know in the comment section below what your top 5 is for all of set 6 and which of those compositions is your favorite. Remember to check out GiantSlayerTV socials in the description below to keep up to date with any news, shows, or other content. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Here's your Giant Slayer TFT videos.